Welcome to Build or Buy webinar. So I'm Masha Cilliers, and I'm going to be joined today by Victor, Thorbjørn, Sharon and Philip to discuss the merits, the pros and cons of whether you want to build, to buy, to partner, and whatever else to do to build your payment solutions. So I'm Masha Cilliers. I'm a consultant in payments. I've been in payments for over 30 years. I've worked for companies like Visa, MasterCard, Microsoft, multiple PSPs, and I have been consulting for a while, working with a lot of merchants and financial institutions to help them address some of the issues that we'll be talking about today. So I will ask the panel to kindly introduce themselves, and maybe if I start with Sharon, please, if you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi there, everybody. I'm the VP of Product Marketing here at Enfuce, and I think some background in terms of how we've arrived at this webinar today. I initiated the topic sort of the late part of last year, and it became a theme following a number of conversations in 2023 precisely on this topic of whether to build or buy, and conversations we were having with customers and prospects in the market. And I thought it was a really good opportunity to start opening up the discussion to a wider debate. So that's why we're here today. We certainly heard last year as a takeaway from Money 2020 that the theme of banks versus fintechs had been put to relaxation, and the narratives of fintechs threatening to render the banks irrelevant is really evaporated now, and we can put that to bed, and it's now more a spirit of collaboration. So hence why we're here to start talking more and sharing thoughts on this topic. So, and over to you, maybe.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Thorbjørn. I am the COO of Pleo, a business spend solution that we basically started in Denmark, but which is now across Europe. I'm the COO, and I run our financial services arm at Pleo. So anything that has to do with financial products, payment processing, partner banks, all of that juicy stuff is something I'm very interested in. Very good to meet you all.
We may have lost Masha there. Philip, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
I will. Thank you. My name is Philip. I'm the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Enfuce. Recently joined. Previously was a co-founder of a digital bank called Majority, which serves the needs of migrants living in the United States. I've worked as both an entrepreneur and an executive in payments and fintech, even before we called it fintech. And had a number of executive roles at companies like Klarna.
Great, thanks, Philip. And certainly, last but not least, Victor, could you just introduce yourself to the callers today?
It's inevitable when you have a webinar that we have technical difficulties.
Indeed. I think we may have lost Masha and Victor. Hi, Victor. Could you introduce yourself to everybody on the call?
Hello, I'm back.
Yes, welcome back, Masha.
The camera just stopped working. As you said, there's always this. So, thank you. Did we get everyone introduced? Victor, did you get a chance to speak?
Unfortunately, Victor wasn't able to introduce himself, so maybe we can move forward. Victor's from Deloitte and has been working in the banking sector, I think, for 20 plus years in terms of advising businesses on their digital transformation journey. And maybe when we get Victor online, he can give us a bit more insight from his background. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you. So thank you very much for joining us today. And as I said, it's an exciting subject, and it's a subject that's always been a challenge in payments. So as I said, I've commenced my career in payments 30-something years ago at Visa, and even then, when we talked to the banks about the issuance or acquiring program, there was always a challenge whether in what part of their portfolio they could build in-house, what they could outsource. There weren't that many options at the time, for example, for acquiring outsourcing, and so forth. So I guess I'd like to kick off our conversation today with saying, what are the kind of foundations, the fundamentals to get right when you start looking at how you build your solution? And maybe, Thorbjørn, we know your camera is working. We start with you for this one, and everybody else as well. If you have any specific questions, by the way, I would really appreciate if you could add your questions on the top right below the survey. And also, please keep in mind that we'd like you to fill out the survey as well, please. So, Thorbjørn, over to you. Thoughts about the fundamentals of how do you start thinking about those decisions of buying, building, and architecture of your systems?
Great, thanks, Masha. I can absolutely elaborate a little bit on that. And I think first off, I would say there's no size fits all. The thing is, I think there's someone, if everyone can mute, I have a little bit of background noise.
Hello.
Okay, that was better.
Hello.
Oh, we hear you. We hear you, Victor.
Is it okay for me to continue, or should we rather let Victor do an introduction?
If you don't mind continuing, and then Victor, you'll jump straight after that, if that's right.
All right, let's do it like that. Thanks, Masha. So what I was saying was there's no sort of one way of doing it. I think it's very, very unique for company to company. What kind of services do you actually need? What do you need to own yourselves? What kind of competencies and skill sets do you need to have in-house versus where do you need a partner? And I can tell you, Masha, from a Pleo perspective, so we're a business spending solution. We are operating in Europe, and we started in Denmark. And when we started out back in 2015, we started partnering all our way through what we call the payment stack, right? Back then also, there was not as much choice as there is today, not as many providers as there is today, where you could sort of more pick and choose the things that you would like to own yourself, which is very important, and a strategic asset or strategic competence that you want to own as an organization. We did not have the luxury of having that choice back then, because back then it was quite a bit different. But what we've come to realize over the course of the last, let's say, 8-9 years, where we've been operating more and more throughout the full payment stack, is there's certain things you want to own, and there's certain things you don't want to own. It's too complex we're a startup or a scale-up now at 850 people, so we've grown really fast over the past 8 years. But I can tell you there's so much complexity that you need to understand, and it's going to be an impossible task for any organization to do everything themselves. So that's probably the one sort of realization that we had. You cannot own everything yourself and be great at it. Now, what do you then need to think about? Well, what we thought about a lot was what kind of customer experience do we want to be able to provide at the end of the day? And which partners can take us some of the way, and which things in the stack do we actually need to continue owning as long as we operate? So there's been a lot of deliberation there on that point. What is it that we want to bring to a customer? And then, hey, what is it that we need to make sure that we own so that we control the customer experience? And then, what has that led to? Well, from a Pleo perspective, it has meant that there's a lot of stuff that we own that we feel is important to own from a customer experience perspective, but there's certainly other items where we really don't want to deal with the complexity. For us, that means something like payment processing, which is very, very complicated thing to do that takes a lot of resource, a lot of competency, a lot of experience. And we've chosen deliberately from day one, and we have never swayed away from that. Say, okay, payment processing, that's a certain skill set that you need. We do not want to take over that complexity, because at the end of the day, that's not something, that's not an experience that we need to control vis-a-vis our customers.
There's a very good analysis, I think, thinking about design, the really identifying what's key to you and what's not key to you, and what you can invest if you have limited resources. We all do. Victor, I think I can see you've got your microphone working now. Would you like to do a very short introduction to yourself? And maybe, whilst you've got the mic as well, tell us about how do you see the fundamentals of building your payments, be that acceptance or issuance architecture, stack up in your view?
So let me first ask you, Masha, can you hear me now? Fantastic. Everything worked perfectly during the check yesterday, and then now nothing worked. So my name is Victor Kotnik. I'm with Deloitte. I'm a partner in Stockholm, and I've been working basically all my career with both advisory and implementation services related to IT in both banks and also actually insurance companies, And I think what I think is important, I think building on what Thorbjørn said, I think it's very important to think about which parts are more commoditized, or easier to buy rather than build, So you can make sure that you focus, your main part of your investments, I guess you could say, but also the management capacity and the capacity of your, DevOps team, on the things where you really want to differentiate, rather than building something which is available on tap, if you will, I think that would be my introduction.
And what are your thoughts, I guess, initial thoughts about, what do we mean that when we talk about kind of the build and buy? Why can't you build everything? Why can't you buy everything? What are your thoughts initially about this kind of the balancing act of what you can and what you can't do?
So I think, you could, of course, technically buy everything, and you could most definitely technically build everything. But I think it's a couple of questions. I think one question is, of course, the investment, right? So if you would want to go ahead and build a core system or a complete card solution or a payment, or other types of payments, you can, of course, build that. But that is quite complicated to build, because you would have to get all of these skills in-house. So I think one aspect is the scarcity of skills, and of course the management capacity to lead that, So and you could also, of course, say that you want to buy everything, but I think there are some things maybe which are more difficult to buy, and those are the things where you really want to differentiate towards your customers, right? So typically I would say here in the Nordics, if you look at the banks, we typically have always, or at least the last 5 to 10 years, there's a pattern that the things that are available and the things that are pretty much standard, payments, cards, that is something that you want to buy, while the banks would rather focus on things where they can differentiate or actually where they have an engagement with their customers, be it the digital channels or be it extra add-on applications to, have a differentiation. So
may chime in, Victor, a little bit from maybe a fintech perspective or a scale-up perspective, right? As you were pointing out, banks might have one way of thinking about things, but I can tell you, as Pleo, we were one of the fastest growing fintechs in Europe, and that means, we've had over the past just 5 years had to expand into 15 new European countries. Very quickly, organizations, all these kind of things, and as well add to the product portfolio, right? And from that perspective, I think build or buy, the time to market and speed to market is a really important component, or at least it has been for us, because when you're scaling up and want to move really, really fast, then that's a different sort of lens of thinking build or buy, or maybe you buy at the outset and then over time you see, do I have market fit in these new regions or in these new countries, and then you do maybe a one iteration of thinking, hey, okay, we came this far with this product market fit in all these new markets this fast. Now let's pause, look back and say, in the future, do we need to own more of the experience in these markets, or can we actually continue to just buy our way out of the pain? Because buying many times is much faster than building.
No, and I think it's a great point there, Thorbjørn. And I mean, it's not just, of course, the commoditized or the back end or the standardized stuff. I mean, we see companies buying, who are rapidly scaling. So, for example, if you're into retail payments, there are companies like Jiffity, which really very quickly can provide a bank, with access to a market in terms of actually providing the user interface as well, and doing a lot of the unique processing that is required in the market, So those are also available. But then, exactly like you said, at some point over time, do you want to take control over these, And I guess that's the balancing act for a scale up.
And then I guess that leads to the question, why what's important to you? So I think, Philip, if I may put you on the spot here, thinking kind of from some of the roles you've played in companies like Klarna and so forth, when you talk about fintechs and differentiation, right? So if you're outsourcing everything, it's presumably going to be harder to differentiate and build some new features that nobody else has thought about yet. Apologies, I'm in popular today. So if you can talk a little bit about, how can you manage differentiation and building new features with, when using some kind of a buy-in solution.
Yeah, I think we've touched on some of the key considerations already with Thorbjørn and Victor. I think there's a standing advice or thought leadership around build versus buy, which is around whether it's in your core competency, or others might say it's whether you should build, or if it is a unique competitive advantage, you should build. I think some companies don't necessarily understand whether they have a certain core competence, and they don't understand whether they have a unique competitive advantage, and it becomes a bit more of a challenging consideration for them. I'd be very interested to hear Thorbjørn's thoughts on how he views core competence versus unique competitive advantage. I'm going to assume that the customer experience that you've mentioned a few times is really what you're focused on. That's your unique competitive advantage. And I'm going to assume you probably have the competency to build payments infrastructure, but you chose to buy. I would love to understand how that played out for you.
Oh, thanks for asking, Philip. I was just about to jump in, actually. I'll put my hand up because I think you're touching on something really important here. So, in terms of build or buy as well, when you and I can only, of course, speak from a sort of fintech scale-up, startup perspective. We are starting something up, we're trying something out, we're trying it out with partners, and then we learn along the way. And this learning along the way, I think, is a very important point, because this whole area is extremely complex. Extremely complex. You can just go further and further and further down. It's so deep. There's so much stuff to think about. And when you're starting up and when you're building a company, we have also our eyes set on our customer and the end customer experience, which goes above and beyond the payments piece of our infrastructure, right? So there's actually something around us not knowing, or potentially fintechs or companies who want to do something like this, not actually having the competency or not the experience to understand what it is that you need to be owning to be able to offer the experience that you want. You see? So deciding on a partner to work with really also comes down to how much of advisory do you get as a customer. That's at least something from personal experience that we've been very, very fortunate to get. Because when you're starting up and building something, the payment infrastructure around that might not be the single most important thing, or at least you have your eyes on multiple different things, meaning you cannot be also the payment specialist and the payment industry expert. And there you rely on the partner to also educate you, to understand, okay, if this is how that is set, and those are sort of the requirements, then probably we need to own this, but not that, or at least not yet. You see what I mean? So getting that advisory and getting that advice from the partner is extremely important, because you're right. Today, Pleo is a very different thing than it was just 3 years ago or 5 years ago, right? Now, today we have big balance sheet, lots of payment specialists, and we could do much more ourselves. But along the way, that has not been the case. So when you're starting to set up something like this, make sure you involve yourself with partners and experts who can actually advise on what is it that you need to buy, because it's not so obvious always, just because of the complexity of the space.
Did you have a level of self awareness that you knew what you didn't know? I know from my own experience in fintech startups, sometimes you have a certain arrogance that you can we'll be able to figure it out. We're a bunch of smart people, it's sometimes not until you find the right partner that you get that advice. But you need to have a certain level of awareness of maybe, okay, let's buy because we don't know what we don't know, and then let's select the right vendor who has the right people who can provide that sort of advisory experience. But were you able to intentionally make that decision at the beginning, or is that something you only learned after having bought and saw that it was a learning opportunity?
Yeah, good question. So for us, we saw it very much in the beginning as infrastructure and not so much a strategic asset to be able to understand the payments infrastructure piece. So we partnered our way out of it. But our sort of perspective on that, Philip, was that we then went with a certain, different partners throughout the stack and got, to put it mildly, some pretty disappointing experiences also throughout the way. You trust a partner to be stable, to be up and running, particularly when it comes to transactions and stuff like that, right? And we were just sort of burnt children in a way. So when we then decided to actually take the first step to say, hey, now we need to do the full scan of what is available out there in the market, what kind of partners do we actually need to look at? So really pausing after starting out 3 years and then pausing and saying, now we look at the full stack. We've now become a little bit wiser and have also more respect towards, what can we actually manage ourselves, but we also have more experience in what do we not want in a partner. And that's actually where we came from. That was our starting point. It's like, okay, nowadays we have a little bit of a checklist of what needs to be in place or what we really cannot accept in terms of downtime and very critical things like that. So that's a little bit the perspective we have.
Very good point, Thorbjørn. From my experience in the more the acquiring side of the business, I found that you almost need to make your own mistakes first, being, Philip, as you're saying, arrogant and thinking, yeah, I know it all, I'm going to do it. Then to realize, well, actually, no, this is not my expertise. And then in some of the PSPs where I worked, we almost waited for clients to make mistakes and come back, sell to them again, because initially they couldn't understand the enormity of the challenge until they got their hands dirty. So, and there was a really, the point about the expertise, that's where the expertise came in. And that's where a lot of, to me, both in issuing and acquiring payments, there are providers who will just give you the tools, and there are providers that will guide you through it. And if you're doing international business, for example, that aspect, you need to have a lot of expertise, normally external, because you won't, but you'll have to burn your fingers on getting, whether that's VAT wrong or some customer specific protection laws wrong, when issuing your products or acquiring your products. So I think, Sharon, maybe from because you see different types of clients dealing with that dilemma. Do you, do you see that similar? They're kind of starting first, then realizing you need to outsource something, or do you see the strategies where outsource everything first and then take bits by bits? And if so, do you have any insight as to which strategy you'd recommend?
Yeah, I think it depends on your starting point, doesn't it? If you're building from scratch, as we've heard from Thorbjørn there, but we work with different size customers, some that are very focused on specific verticals and some that have wider propositions for different product portfolios. And, I think some of the areas that it's more complex are the larger established, the incumbent banks, the large enterprises, where they have much more complex legacy infrastructure. And I think where we see the challenge is like going from the sort of phase of building on top of that and having, digital interaction with customers and improving that customer experience to actually, when does the shift start to take place in terms of like really rebuilding complex legacy infrastructure. And that's partly why we started moving into this debate and thinking about, you know, it's almost like very difficult to start the conversation, because where do you start with such huge legacy infrastructure conversations, and what to start building? Do you build adjacent? You know, we in the broader report that supports this webinar, you know, we heard from Seb how they started to build a new bank as a new proposition while still running on their legacy side of things. So we hear from lots of different, you know, some are starting out, some are established and then getting into a more cloud native type solution and build on the side. But I think the bigger challenges are coming through from the very large, complex legacy banks, you know, incumbent banks, where, as I say, they've been, you know, without sounding harsh, window dressing in terms of the experience from the consumer perspective. But how do they move from where they are now into the, you know, really cloud native, forward looking approach to building solutions? So I don't have an answer for the latter. I think that's what this debate's about as much as anything. So
if we build on that kind of that move from one to another. So again, from my you know, time in schemes, for example, we, you know, when I see an issuer, for example, doing an RFP for a new payment system, you know, this is a process that takes between 5 and 10 years to actually migrate and move everything. So on one hand, we're saying, well, it's kind of great because we can kind of start with one, then choose. But actually, if you're talking about scale, the types of banks you're referring to, then actually moving between the solutions, that's a big exercise. So Thorbjørn, you're nodding there. Do you have some thoughts? And then may I remind the audience, please, do ask us questions. If you pop the questions into the on the top hand right of your browser, you'll see the question button. Put the questions in. I'll be able to read them out to the to our panel as well. So Thorbjørn, your thoughts about moving between the choices that you've made and legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Masha. Yeah, I was nodding just because I can relate. And I think you're hitting on something really important here. So when you partner, right, in this world, in the payments world and with banking infrastructure, it's not a supplier-customer relationship. At least that's not how I see it. I see it more as a partnership. You really, you know, marriage of sorts. You don't want to do this every 10 years. You actually preferably want to go with the right partner and grow with them. So, you know, whenever someone is switching, and I so agree, like this RFP process, they can drag out, and the bigger your installed portfolio, well, the longer it will take, and it's not easy. And having done it, I can tell you, we all have at Pleo the battle scars of moving. This was then a payment processing service, but that in itself is a big thing. So yes, I was just nodding because I think it's so crucial that you understand, you know, and you have a good, very good both chemistry but also understanding of your partner, and that I would advise anyone who's looking for buying any service of this magnitude and in this space to really think about it more as a partnership than a supplier-customer relationship, because if you are then not satisfied, it is very difficult to switch, or at least it will take some, you know, people might know how to do it, but it is indeed a very costly and, you know, just resource and labor intensive exercise to switch out providers. So for the benefit of everyone, it's better to make sure that you do the due diligence and, you know, you have a solid process up to the point where you decide this is the vendor, this is the supplier, or as I call it, this is the partner that we're gonna go into partnership with. And, you know, focusing more on sort of front loading that work to really understand who are the people on both sides. I would just strongly advise towards that, rather than going for maybe a little bit more of a paper-based exercise and then making the deal and then, you know, 18, 24, 36 months down the line, figuring out, ooh, this capability is missing, or this service is actually not as stable as we thought. Because then at that point in time, it will be very difficult to switch providers. This is I think internally we call, you know, switching payment processor more of a lung and heart transplant at the same time, right? Because you're running your business at the same time. So yes, cannot advise more for, you know, really doing the due diligence, knowing who the people are on the other side before you make changes in your infrastructure like that.
No, thank you. Those are great points. And Victor, if I may pick you, I guess from Deloitte's experience with multiple clients, do you see, is there a good way that you could design, a bit to Thorbjørn's point, design your architecture so it's a little bit easier to slot in new providers and pull them out? Is there a way that, so a kind of a preparation in your thought process that could go as a foundation, more modular, you know, kind of approach, more cloud-based approach that will allow you to make changes easy in the future? Is any good examples that you've come across? Can't hear you. I think you're on mute still.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a great question. And I think if you look at the 7 big banks in the Nordics, you know, or perhaps the ones I mainly work with, I also work with some of the tier 2, and that's very different, you know. But I mean, I think their focus for many years now has really been, you know, to improve in their customer relationships, you know, so their front end, their systems of differentiation and that type of thing. But they have also invested very, very heavily in, you know, decoupling some of their architectures. They didn't all come from the same starting point, you know. Some were and still are in really bad shape, where everything is a spaghetti, you know, core system, payments, cards, corporate lending, everything, you know. While some of them actually had a good architecture already 25 years ago, you know. But I think those who haven't, they have focused a lot on really, you know, trying to decouple things, trying to remove functionality from some of their core backend infrastructure or whatever you call them, applications, you know. And they are working on that to be able to then replace them with something which you can buy as a service or otherwise, you know. Because if you have, let's say, card software where lots of, you know, things that are not really the core domain or bundled into that code for historical reasons, that will mean it's very hard to replace it. So I think that is where they have had their focus, you know. So cleaning their architecture very slowly and then working on those things that the customer can see, if you put it that way. I think we are starting to see a shift now where some of these big banks are, you know, starting to look more seriously at going after, you know, and evaluating their infrastructure backend applications and say, okay, is this fit for the future? Do we need to change it? You know, how do we go about it? You know, so just the last 2 years, I mean, 2 of the big 7 have started that journey, you know, and one of them has been going on for 10 years, as I'm sure so many of you know. But these are huge programs, you know, and they don't really want to do it unless they really see the value and the need for it, you know, because like you said, Masha, these are 5 to 10 year journeys, you know, and they will end people's careers basically, you know. So it's always very tempting to say, oh, let's renovate a little bit and let's keep it a little bit longer. But we are seeing the movement now, and they have been focusing on cleaning the architectures up quite a bit.
Victor, a question for you.
Sorry, absolutely.
Yeah, a question for you, Victor. I'm curious how you see things, like when you hear Thorbjørn talk about how important it is to actually understand the people and the company behind the people and products when you're choosing to buy. How does that apply when you're in these large organizations like banks and tier 1 customers? My experience is that oftentimes there's an executive sponsor who is making the purchasing decision, but then they need there's a finance committee or there's a whole separate department who's requiring them to tick boxes on a checklist. Yeah. And so the purchase authority or the purchase decision is distributed across a large organization with competing interests. Yeah. Are you seeing that they're able to navigate that effectively, or what kind of considerations are these tier 1 clients making as it relates to really understanding who they're buying from and whether they're a good partner for the long term?
So it's a couple of, you know, questions on that one. It's a great question. I think the first answer, I think, is that the biggest complexity is perhaps not for these banks or players who they should be buying from. It's whether should they even do the project, because they have so many internal conflicting demands, There are many people fighting for the budgets all across the bank, So where should we prioritize our money? So I think that is really the first important step. But if they get past that and they say, okay, now we're going to get a new cards partner or a new core banking system partner, I think a few things. I think the first one is, it's a trust business, Consulting is a trust business, but I also think the software and software as a service business is also largely that, because companies don't really buy from companies, right? People buy from people. So I think the trust has to be there first, And then I think then we will always look, of course, at the economics of it, especially when you're moving from traditional setups like software, you have it on premise, you know how that works, you know how that costs, If you start to move into a modern environment, how will this cloud-based service, how will that behave from an economic standpoint over time? So they need to understand and evaluate that, of course, that would be important. Then I think the biggest thing, which and I don't know, I think it's partly a Nordic thing, to be honest, We are a little bit conservative, but I think a really big thing is that the banks are looking at each other, right? So they want to buy something that somebody else who is similar to them in size and complexity have successfully implemented. Because otherwise they realize they will be sort of first out, and even if you technically and logically can prove, no, it should work, then that is something that a lot of people in the Nordics, in the banks, would perceive as a risk, to be first with something very new. We are quite conservative up here, which is strange, because in some areas we are not, but I guess maybe we're a little bit too much of an engineering society. We want to be in control of everything, So those are the things, I think, the economics of a new types of solution, the personal trust. And then, will we be the first to do this among our peers? That is a bit scary.
Victor, that's a very good point. And that leads me, we've got a question from the audience now, which is quite close to my heart, actually. It's talking about the desire by technically capable customers to build everything themselves. So I worked for Microsoft for a while, and we built everything in-house. But because of that, anytime we made a change, it was like a 2-year project, definitely from the payment side of things. So how do you, and I think, again, there's some interesting points raised by all of you just earlier, talking about sometimes it's just down to the politics of somebody's personal job. If I selected that provider, if somebody says that provider is bad, that somehow is badly reflecting on me then. So how could you, is there a way to some sort of formula that we can suggest ongoing operational costs and workloads and managing that? The cost aspect is again, definitely one I'd like us to explore a little bit further in terms of, you kind of, pardon the expression, going on the needle. Once you go to the big provider, they're going to always charge you for that. The bigger you get, the more you pay ultimately. So your management, again, may think it was a bad decision on your part because you should have, if you built in-house, the cost would have decreased with volumes, not increased. So, but is there a way that you can think about it in, I guess, mathematical terms, in terms of how much you're saving or effort, how much you're saving in costs? Anyone wants to take that, or shall I?
I can start. I think that exercise that you mentioned, that is just something you have to get through. To me, that's an Excel spreadsheet exercise with a little bit of negotiation, I guess, in with it as well. You go to some players, not maybe so much in the financial services business, but to SAP, they have a price list. No one ever pays the prices in the price list. It's kind of hard to get the right numbers in that Excel spreadsheet. But I think the other thing which is important is then the contracting, right? So you need to make sure in your contracting, or that the contract allows, to make sure that financial model you build, or the business case, that that is being protected by the commercial terms in the contract. So that would be my take on that.
Just add a little bit on that, Victor, from our perspective, or from sort of a scale-up perspective, right? I think that latter point you make on the contract, I think, is very important. particularly looking at it from a lens of like, this is not a supplier of ours. And actually, we don't need protection, we need flexibility. We don't know where this partnership will go, and we need to make sure that it's beneficial for both parties to grow and become successful. At least that's the sort of lens that we've had. And I know Pleo's situation is not similar to every other company, but in a scale-up situation or a high-growth situation, if you find yourself as that as an organization, it's of course crucial that you grow in a profitable way, in a good way that both benefits you yourself, but also the supplier or the partner. I think that is important. And that's what I've seen over the past 10 years, that, some providers look at themselves more as providers. Some suppliers look at themselves more as suppliers, not as partners, meaning very, very strict on, actually, as you mentioned, price list, or this is exactly how we set it up, and we cannot do it in any other way. So they are not able to, they're so set in their ways, and they're able to sort of cater for the specific potential customer case. And that, I think, is an important one, because if you find yourself in a sort of fast-growing industry where you're really, really growing and you need to sort of capture market share and you need to move fast, you need to grow, that is really important to sort of somehow creatively bake that in to whichever agreement you're making with your supplier or your partner, so that both you can say, hey, over the next X quarters or next couple of years, then we do a pause and we sort of look each other in the eye and we sort of like say, hey, now we are in a new place. Let's see how the future is looking like from that point in time. But also that the mechanics of the deal is beneficial for both parties as you grow, so that the incentives are aligned. So a little bit back to bring the supplier so close that it becomes a partner, that actually, the economic and financial upside, it falls on both of you if this partnership is successful.
I agree.
And then we've seen some of that in e-commerce, where they've built ecosystems where suppliers could plug in some of their wares, if you like, and then they become available. So you're managing effectively that family of partners rather than trying to build stuff yourself. So that's actually, as I said, on the e-commerce kind of a shopping cart acceptance. I've seen a lot of that. We have another question here in terms of we talked about the building and buying and the cost analysis. What about certain organizational capabilities? Is somebody like Microsoft forever going to be building? Is there a particular organizational setup that is more likely to do one or another? And is there a way to improve that? So is there an organizational structure you can build which will support more outsourcing approach potentially? Thorbjørn, do you want to comment on that first?
Sure. So again, caveat that this is talking from a sort of a Pleo mindset and our situation, but I would say, well, from what I've seen working in different types of organization, this you own what you build approach. From a tech perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, you own what you build. That's something that we live by in Pleo, that you build the service, you also then own the maintenance of that service. That just sets the bar a little bit higher in terms of quality, in terms of fixing the bugs that are always there and stuff like that. The same approach you can actually use for buying, right? So, as long as you have, let's say, full commitment or an ownership culture where you know what you're responsible for, and what you're responsible for, it's end-to-end responsibility. That actually also makes the buy versus build discussion easier in my mind. Because when you are setting up a service or you're looking at something that you want to start out, you will sit there and you will say, okay, do I buy or do I build? And you will think all the way through, just not only the building and the what might be actually very interesting, particularly for engineers, to build something new, and that's always exciting, but then the maintenance afterwards might not be as exciting, right? And then it sort of gives that extra layer in the discussion before you decide building or buying, if you have that ownership, end-to-end ownership mindset. So not so much necessarily an organizational setup, but more sort of like an ownership or end-to-end ownership mindset, that if you are in a team that is building something or launching a market or needing to develop this new payment capability, you own from beginning to the end. If you have that mindset, then that will create that will facilitate a much more informed build or buy discussion in my mind.
to build, if I may build on what Thorbjørn is saying, I mean, I agree 100%, and I think it's very well put. That you own what you build mentality should be there. You own what you buy as well. So I think it's a great way of putting it. Well, I would just like to add. Typically, we work with the large insurers, the large banks. And this is often a very big deal for them. When they have had not just the front end, which they typically build on their own, but they have this huge portfolio of large back-end infrastructure, systems of record, which they built over many years, and they have a big maintenance organization. Typically, guys of my age, who know COBOL and stuff like that. Now, when you then move and you replace big portions of that portfolio of solutions with, software as a service, or for that matter, just software bought and installed on-prem, that's a huge deal. So there's always a component in that type of projects where you really have to decide what's the future IT operating model. You always end up in union negotiations. That's actually a big part of these big projects, because it's a huge change for the IT department, And they also have to perhaps get rid of some people, and they get to have new type of people who are really skilled at sourcing, and managing maybe this, like a network of different cloud applications working together. How do you manage that? That's a new skill, right? So for those big legacy banks, it's a big change, right?
And if I could just jump in, from my perspective, I think when you look at the organizational architecture of companies and whether I don't think there's one exact way to set up a company to effectively build or buy. It's much more, as Thorbjørn was thinking, that you have to first really understand what your unique competitive advantage is and where your core competencies are. A good analogy that I can think of is, I don't know if it's current, but fairly recently, you look at a difference between Japanese automotive manufacturers and some of the US-based automotive manufacturers like GM. The Japanese automotive manufacturers are outsourcing most of the manufacturers of the car. The parts in the car, I think they make like 30% of the parts in their car, compared to like a GM where I think it was like 60 or 70% of the parts in their cars they're making. Yeah. That doesn't say that one approach is better than the other, but it's around understanding from a business standpoint, how will you win? What's your winning aspiration? Yeah. What are your core competencies? What is your unique competitive advantage? And then you organize your management systems based off of your business strategy. And then in that context, you'll have the ability to understand if that is appropriate for making build versus buy decisions.
Mm-hmm. And what about, I have another question there about the banks' hesitation to modernize potentially based on the fact that they're not trusting third-party providers. How does one manage those risks, or risks to the brand, risks to the service? How does one, I think some of the themes you guys discussed earlier as well, in terms of be that, downtime, service and new builds, because that's the biggest challenge, getting your partners to build new things when you want them, because ultimately if you're outsourcing your technology to them, you're dependent on their roadmaps as well. A comment here in terms of how important to build that trust between your partner rather than supplier and the buyer. Again, Thorbjørn, you're nodding. Do you have some examples there? And maybe Philip, if you can jump after that with your thoughts as well. Thorbjørn, you're on mute.
Oh, still? Is it working?
Yeah, you're back now.
Oh, sorry about that. Well, Masha, I'm just nodding because I think it's sort of for me, it's the same thing. You look at a supplier, then you look at the supplier might be an enterprise that's been around for 50 years. It might be a fintech startup that has, been around for 3 years, right? So, regardless, it might be, you look at this partner, and for me, the approach would always be the same. Create a partnership by aligning incentives and really understanding the financial, that builds some sort of financial upside for both parties in order for the partnership to become successful. That's one. And number two is, who is actually behind the corporate entity? Who is it that you're going to work with? Because a partnership like the ones that we're discussing, it will have good times and there will be bad times. And it's very much in the latter, during the latter, you figure out, okay, did you decide on the right partner? So, there are different types of risks. With a big enterprise, if you decide to bring them on board as a partner, you might be able to align the incentives. However, when you need this new feature, you are just a really, really small fish. You're not the biggest customer. You're not going to get any airtime, and you're going to just always be sort of deprioritized. That's a huge risk of choosing a large enterprise as a partner. On the other hand, choosing a startup or scale up, it might be that they want to do something completely different, or there's something on their side in terms of their finances, or there are other types of risks. So I actually wouldn't see it from a different lens. I would more say it's a partnership. Bring them close, align incentives, and understand who are the people behind this. And if it happens that the startup is being sold or the enterprise is getting chopped up into business units and sold, whatever, the new buyer, the new owner will look at what are the successful partnerships, where are we making money, what is successful, and then that comes back down to the agreement and the partnership that you have established. And in that case, it doesn't really matter whether your partner is a big enterprise or a small startup. I think it's the same.
Actually, I'll jump in myself there as well, because I think that the couple of points you've raised there really close to my heart as well, because I run a lot of RFPs for clients, and what I always tell the clients as a starting point is, like, don't look at the price first, because everyone gets their RFPs like, okay, let's get to the spreadsheet of the fees. That to me is the most, it's an important factor, but it's probably the most misleading factor as well. To the point you're making, what I tried, I think a couple of questions they were talking about, how can you future-proofing picking a provider, or is there a list of tricks and tips? I would start with really trying to get to know the company you're talking to. So your point there about knowing who the ultimate ownership. Unfortunately, in the payment business, that's not solid, right? Because somebody's owned by one company this year and then they get bought by another one, or your competitor. So you can't quite future-proof for that. But you can future-proof for attitude to a large degree. For example, I recently did an RFP for a client where, we've got wonderful salespeople. The salespeople are selling that particular acquiring system were great. But then, in my experience, often once you get passed on to the account management, that becomes a very different issue altogether. So what we tried to do is we interviewed account management. We talked to the person who leads that team. We tried to talk to other people. I mean, obviously, you talk to the existing clients. But to me, it's really trying to drill into those questions. Don't take what they give you, which is a shiny picture of the world, which is their responses to tenders. Try to dig deeper, whether it means going to their offices and hanging out with them and looking at how they operate, to really align, back to your point, Thorbjørn, to align incentives, so that that they want the same thing as you. Because if all they want is to get a few big clients and then get sold, then they might not be a good partner for you for multiple reasons, right? So that's quite I guess a point I feel passionately about. Philip, would you like to add anything here about this kind of future-proofing and working out how to select those partners that can last with you long term, so you can build trust?
Yes, I think both of you raised some critical points. And I think in my experience, it's worthwhile to do the advanced preparation on which questions you want to ask and which ones are the most important. Too often I see, even from a fintech who is running a fairly lightweight purchasing process to even a more in-depth RFP, oftentimes they haven't captured all of the potential risks in advance, and they don't even know then to answer the questions, because they might get too excited about just having a solution, or the pricing is great. So my recommendation is really spend the time to write a vendor due diligence document, ask the questions you need to ask. Often it is, as you and Thorbjørn have mentioned, you might need to go there. What happened in their last outage? Who is on there? What's their incident management process? How do you handle on-calls? How do you do disaster recovery? If they're a regulated business, what is their compliance function? When was their last audit? What is their financial risk, geopolitical risk, people risk? What's their employee turnover? It's not fairly complicated to do, but you have to spend the time to doing it in advance to make sure that you are asking the right questions and that you're able to know what you don't know.
There's a fabulous point. Sorry, go on.
No, I was thinking just to add on to that. I mean, when putting on the hat of the big institutions and banks, I would say that generally speaking, or at least 70%, the banks really dislike their partners. They are disappointed at the service, at the deliveries. They didn't get what they expected. The people responsible, they have their bosses after them for this. It's a trust issue, and I think one of our common services is actually what we call marriage counseling. So just the last couple of years, we've done 3 projects where there were situations where the large institution and the partner, they refused to talk to each other, and I mean, that's a really bad situation, But one model that I would just like to highlight, which we see emerging among the bigger players, is that they think, maybe it's easier to deal with a smaller fintech type of provider. I mean, not somebody who started out yesterday, but somebody smaller than the really big companies. And what they do then is the new model is they go in and they buy a stake in the company, to have some degree of influence and control, and that sort of solidifies the partnership. And I think that's an interesting model, and we're starting to see that more and more.
I think we've only got 4 minutes left, so I think, Victor, I'll take that as the start of your closing comments in terms of, how you build that. And I think there's a very strong. I mean, obviously, we'll be following up with more comments, and by all means, jump on LinkedIn on the chat that we've started on this subject, because there's a lot of points that are still relevant in terms of, what you were saying about the banks are looking at their partners as suppliers really rather than partners. Therefore, they don't build that friendship. It's some kind of subservient relationship in some cases. There was a couple of comments recently about, is it choosing the established partners versus small partners, what is better? So there's a lot of open questions. I think we won't have time, unfortunately, to talk of all of that. So I think I'd like to, we've literally got 3 minutes left. I think I'd like Philip, Thorbjørn and Sharon to add to what Victor was saying in terms of, what do you think are the fundamentals for making the success? It seems that we've leaned towards, we've started talking about buying and then we're talking about partnerships. I think it's a given, really, what buy or build is all about partnerships. So if you maybe give me a few of your closing comments, and we would really appreciate the audience to please give your feedback before you leave, because once you cut off, you won't be able to put it in. So please go to the right and go on the survey at the top right. And so over, Sharon, maybe to you for your closing thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Lots of great comments today, but I think my takeaway is sort of whether a large enterprise or small fintech, both can go wrong for different reasons. Neither one is more risky than the other, and it's about alignment of incentives and building trust across the teams, not just the initial sales conversations. So whether you're an enterprise or a fintech, that's not the risk. It's about not getting those incentives aligned. So that's what my takeaway from today's conversation is.
Thank you. Philip, your last thoughts on what we discussed?
It's important to understand your core competencies. Make sure you understand what your unique competitive advantage and differentiation is in the market, and buy for competitive advantage, and or build for competitive advantage, and buy for parity or table stakes, and really do your due diligence and focus on buying from a partner.
Okay, and last but not least, Thorbjørn, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say, buy from a partner, not a supplier. Make it a partner. Make it a partnership where you both benefit, and make sure that you understand and know the partner. Invest in front-loading the work before you sign the deal. Get to know the people. Then it will be potentially a successful partnership.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I guess summarizing all that we discussed in about under a minute, as I said, we've moved towards partnership rather than supply and buy, and definitely that kind of goes together with the points we discussed about aligning the desires, because it's a fast-moving market. That's one point that's very key to the payments generally. So you need to work with somebody who you know is going to be supporting you going forward. And to do that, you need to go into it with your eyes open to the points that we've all made earlier, in drilling into understanding your partner, not just what the salesperson who is selling to you wants you to believe, but really understanding the mentality of the organization and making sure that that partner is going to be supporting you for the sort of thick and thin, a bit like marriage, really. So yes, make sure you do go on enough dates before you get married. I think we'll probably end it there. Thank you very much to the participants, Thorbjørn, Philip, Sharon, Victor. Thank you very much for the organisers, Enfuce, and thank you very much for all your wonderful questions. Do not forget, you still got a few seconds to finish the survey. We really appreciated talking to you today, and please ping us on LinkedIn if you have any questions, and we can discuss the subject matter there further. Thank you very much.
Thank you.